I'm Natalie, Natalie Evans-Harris, and I'm going to moderate a panel for you today focused on bias and ethics in city services data science. And so we have a panel of 5 folks that we're going to talk about this with. We're going to keep this pretty interactive and loosey-goosey. So we're going to have each of the panelists give a spiel on their perspective related to this topic, and then we'll go to questions. I can prompt with the first question, or if you guys have something burning to ask, we can start with the question you have. But we're going to keep this pretty lightweight. It's 45 minutes and the last session of the day. So, and I like to keep things fun to entertain myself. So why are we here today? We're here today to talk through the implications of ethics and bias in data science with local data. This is from the perspective of data scientists using city-level data, as well as the implications for citizens who are trusting us to use that data. So this conversation is going to cover both sides. The first person we'll hear from will be Hunter.
Yeah.
Hunter.
Hey, everybody. I'm Hunter Owens. I'm the senior data scientist at the City of Los Angeles, getting to really see everything city data-wise, as we like to say, from the airport to the zoo, as those are both city departments. So why I'm here today is to talk about the importance of being a public servant first and a data scientist second, and really serving your residents and informing the community of practice that will result in better policy, health, and lifestyle outcomes. That is a zip code level map of Flint, Michigan. If you notice that, a zip code is a terrible unit to do analysis by, because this completely masks the lead pollution problem in Flint almost perfectly. So we missed it for 2 years that lead poisoning rates were skyrocketing in Flint because we were checking at the zip code level averages. So if we do this work incorrectly, if we fail to accommodate the bias and look into this, the stakes are really, really high. This is not low stakes, you know, oh, somebody saw an ad that they didn't want to click on. This is literally, and I mean this in full seriousness, and then I promise I'll be more jovial after this, a matter of life and death.
Julia?
Okay, yeah. So I'm next. My name is Julius Tiana. I'm an assistant professor of computer science at Drexel in Philadelphia, but I live in New York City. My background is in data management, and the work that my colleagues and I have been focusing on has to do with how one manages, shares, integrates, and analyzes data in a way that is responsible. And of course, responsibility has multiple aspects, and a particular aspect that I would like to focus on today has to do with transparency and interpretability of the collection and use of data in administrative services. So specifically, some of you may know that City Council member Vaca recently introduced a bill to amend the administrative code of the City of New York in relation to automated processing of data for the purposes of targeting services, penalties, or policing of persons. And this bill aims to make data-intensive processes in the city transparent. And specifically, there are 2 provisions here. The first is that any agency that uses an algorithm or an algorithmic system to make decisions about such services has to make the source code of the system available on its website, available online. And the second point is that a user must be permitted to submit data into such system for self-testing and to receive the results of having such data processed by such system. So in my view, this is a laudable attempt because it really does try to tackle the current lack of transparency in the way that algorithmic systems and data are used by city services. But my provocation is that asking for the kind of transparency that this bill provides is at the same time too much, because source code of the system has to be released, and source code in its own actually is not going to be that insightful. So it's too much, and at the same time, it's not enough to provide transparency. Instead, what I would like to advocate is that we need tools that enable interpretability, that can explain the process of data collection and the results to a variety of stakeholders. And these stakeholders are individuals, individual users. They are designers of these systems. They're also policymakers and the general public. And what I have here that you're looking at on the slide is a kind of a nutritional label that is for processes that produce ranked results, results that are ordered, prioritized, and in which there are different widgets that explain different aspects of the data or of the process. So I think that we should work towards such explainable, interpretable systems.
Thank you. And Sarah, I think you're up next.
Yeah, so I'm not a data scientist. I'm a designer, and I'm focused on the translation of all of this data into something that someone who doesn't have a background in data, someone who doesn't necessarily want to look at a spreadsheet or look at numbers or just doesn't have the ability to, perhaps, can understand what's going on with that data. So I'll talk a little bit about this slide as an example. This is pulled from, these were index cards. And in, I think, 2014 for the city and county of LA, I helped run a workshop with a couple of hundred people who had all different types of backgrounds and were representing different elements of LA in different interests. So NGOs, people from the city, as well as engaged citizens. And LA had just opened up their Socrata portals, and Hunter, please correct me on any of this information if I happen to be wrong. They had just opened up their Socrata portal, and they put all this data online. And so there was this movement around open data, and that was important in order to provide transparency to citizens and show people what the government was actually doing. But when you look at a spreadsheet, if you do not have a background in data analysis, let alone data science, you really cannot make sense of it. Or I guess to say, like, open government and transparency is not necessarily clear. It's not necessarily meeting that end goal. So what I did here with these index cards was provide a little bit of background on what this is a data set, essentially. So this is what you're looking at is a spreadsheet. But instead of seeing rows and columns, you're seeing like what's included, for instance, on that right-hand side of job title or department. And this is translated from what would have been industry jargon. It would have said, you know, something underscore, and then a code that would have been like, these are the different types of departments being represented. We also see on the left side here what the focuses were. So like a focus on money, rather than just showing that there's a column here that has a budget amount. And then on the bottom line, you see like affects jobs and affects finances. And so this is a data set that affects jobs. When you're thinking about how jobs in LA work, this is the payroll for government workers, you might consider this data set. And so it's starting to translate that data set in a way where you don't have to look at the spreadsheet, you don't have to really consider the numbers or the meat of the data, but instead, what are the implications of this data set? And then on the far right, how could you use this data is an example. And these are all just things I just like kind of created in the moment. But it's translating what that spreadsheet could be used for. It's a potential. And so in this case, it was, I want to make a product. So a user-friendly financial planning app for LA County residents. And then it went into exactly what the goal of that would be, and then exactly what columns you would need from this spreadsheet in order to build that app. And so getting a little bit more granular as you move down the row there. And so this is a way to demonstrate to someone who may not care to actually look at a spreadsheet and go through an analysis with you, what they can get out of this data, why it's useful. And the reason that's useful is you can then bring expertise into the room that you may not. And so having someone who has a strong background in community planning or working with communities who may not be a data scientist or a data analyst, who can then have the same level of expertise at a table where you're doing a workshop, for instance. Conversely, you can also work with citizens this way. So people who don't want to engage with your data analytics at all. So this is an example of a community project with a library in Santa Monica in which I asked people to imagine the library of the future. And I gave them a lot of different tokens, a lot of different just squares that said, like, I want someone who's really good at explaining Rhino or CAD programs, or I want you know, access to drills and drill bits. And so if you've got this public space, how would you reimagine it? And this became essentially, this was qualitative data, but you can code and categorize this into quantitative data and say, like, okay, so 40% of residents actually want increase in technology, 30% want an increase in people who have expertise. And so you start giving people tools that speak to them using language that they understand, that they care about, that respects their perspective, and then on the back end, you start rolling that into the kinds of questions that you want to ask of the data that you have. And so, so that's kind of my job, is to translate between what people, I'm going to stop there. It's translation. Design is translation. OK.
Thank you, Sarah. And I think Matt is up next.
Oh, great. So I'm Matt from Bright Hive and the University of Chicago Center for Data Science and Public Policy. And the main point that I want to make is that I think that the institutions that we have in place to be our ethical safeguards are structurally insufficient for the moral task of doing applied data science in a civic setting. And in particular, I think I want to talk about IRBs. So yeah, we're gonna get more
exciting.
That's right. So I don't know, a lot of the articles that we've read recently, right, about studies that have been perhaps ethically dubious, or at least kind of created conversation, whether those be kind of the Facebook studies on influence, or even the most recent study about detecting your sexual orientation just based on your picture, right? All of the important thing to know about all of these is that they all passed an institutional review board, right? So that a group of research peers looked at the research proposal and said, yes, this is a good idea. It's got research merit, and it's going to be done in an ethically responsible way. The main thing that the main thing that I want to argue for is that I think it's silly for us to think that our research peers, who we already have in some ways some established trust, right, and a lot of private companies are now setting up their own IRBs, right, to do this. It's, I think, wrong-headed to think that that is sufficient for the weighty moral task of having a good ethical screen on the work we do. And I think the reason for that, especially in a civic setting, is that, frankly, almost always, those peers, the people that sit on the IRB, don't know what it's like to be the person that may be negatively affected by that particular study. And this is especially true in a civic setting. So I actually think that we have to think more creatively about where the locus of control lies for ethical review, for work that is going to affect citizens. And to not just like put something out there and not have potential models that we could follow, I want to talk about one particular model that I think is at least an effort in the right direction. And that is what's up here. This is a project called the Array of Things that was NSF funded, that has now been implemented in the city of Chicago, that had as its main goal to be kind of the Fitbit for a city. So the thing in the top left is a whole big array of sensors that are collecting data on not just temperature, but motion going past it. It's an array of sensors that is also non-static, so researchers can add new things. So it's new instrumentation for civic space or collective space. In doing this, initially when the idea was put out there was an article that was put out that unnecessarily asked a whole bunch of questions about the ethical responsibility in creating this kind of, frankly, surveillance. Right? And that prompted a lot of what I think is very good responsible work, which is they created a website that went into detail about what data was going to be collected in this work before anything was put up, physically put up. What was going to be done with the data, what was going to be allowed to be done with the data, how your individual security and privacy was going to be protected. But then they didn't just leave it there. Right? I think the most important thing is that they went on a series of community engagement listening tours where they said, this is what we want to do. We're going to educate you on the work, the aspirations of this. We want to know all of your concerns. How might this affect you in ways that we haven't thought about? And that actually informed not only the ways they changed the work and the associated allowable studies, but actually the structure, the governance model, and the ongoing ethical review of work that happens as a result of that implementation. And that kind of front-loaded engagement with a community that's going to be both studied and potentially affected by that work is certainly high cost, higher cost than an existing IRB, but I think it carries the necessary moral weight of the work that we're doing.
And next is Bill.
So my name's Bill Howe. I'm an associate professor at the Information School at the University of Washington. So Seattle has been the area that we've been mostly focused on this. And I think there's this line to draw, and Matt sort of set this up a little bit about, what's the responsibility of the technologists and what's the responsibility of kind of a set of human, the wet work to do the community engagement and so on. And I guess I want to kind of advocate for the line should be a little further to the human side than it typically is associated. What I mean by that is that I think we're letting the technologists off the hook too much. So point one is, there's two, I claim that there's two ways that we sort of make predictions about the world. One is on our own past experience, and the other is some notion of societal norms or laws or so on. We've gotten very, very good at making predictions based on past experience with computers, right? We train them, and there's essentially no decision that humans can make that computers can't basically do as well now based on past experience. We've done almost no effort to try to teach them how to follow societal norms and obey the law and so on. And I think the examples of some of the laws that are coming out on the books, the EU passed a law last year at some point, and some in a couple of states related to the recidivism case that I'll talk about in a second. There's kind of for any decision made by an algorithm, then the human needs to review that and so on. I think that's pretty wrong-headed, and the reason is it gives up all the benefits of actually trying to automate this stuff in the first place, where it could potentially be more objective, where it could potentially scale and so on. Moreover, you've not given the human any sort of empowerment to be able to actually judge that. You've now given them a black box to spit out a number and now say it's entirely your responsibility to interpret that number and say this is how it should go. So I advocate for getting the technology stack to be more aware of these sort of situations of bias sort of further up the pipeline. And the example I like comes from Philadelphia, not Seattle, although this has been all over the news, the ProPublic article that people are familiar with and so on. But I was struck by this one where there's a hearing about one of these recidivism models, and they were kind of receiving feedback, and somebody stood up in the audience and was like, look, as a African-American male has been arrested, should I be afraid of your models? And the answer was, no, you got to tell me a lot more about yourself. At what age were you first arrested, and, how your friends have been arrested, what were the crimes, so forth. And he was like, yeah, and what was the culture of policing in the neighborhood in which I grew up? And it's like, of course I was arrested. I was slightly more likely to be arrested at a younger age. Of course there's certain crimes that are going to be there because that's where you're collecting the data from. And so this idea that, the bias is this downstream thing that we think about at the algorithm level is wrong. In fact, on the teletype, I think outside, at this event, there was kind of can we truly have an unbiased algorithm? I don't even know what that means. The algorithm is not really relevant here. It's about the sources of data and about the sort of transformations of the data, things that are much further upstream that we need to be more aware of. I think a lot of the work in this space is thinking about that final mile of how can we do sort of fancy machine learning algorithms that sort of balance accuracy and fairness and so forth. And that's great work, and we should continue doing that work. But I claim that most of the problems with bias are coming much further up the stack, where people are making they feel like they're making innocuous decisions about choosing that data set over this data set, or choosing that column over this column in order to put together into some nice, clean, sparse matrix that they can go train a model with. And those decisions are going to be killing us at times. They're introducing crazy biases that we don't really understand and so on. And so I think a technology platform that can sort of help people make those decisions with awareness of bias is sort of what we're interested in building, and some work with Julia and Matt and some others that we're trying to do. That's what we're sort of pushing for. And I guess the last point I'll make is that what's interesting about this space too in context of cities is that this is important for everybody to do, like all the companies and so on, but cities have an absolute mandate to distribute resources equitably, right? So they have no access to this technology, this predictive analytics, the data revolution, whatever, unless you get this stuff right? They simply can't use this stuff unless they figure out the bias problem too. That's not really true of the companies of the world who are applying this stuff. They can probably get away with it for a while, even if they're not aware of this. But if cities are going to pick this stuff up, we kind of have to help them sort of do it right. I'll stop there.
Thank you. So based on everybody's spiel, the common theme I kind of heard through everything was just around your perspective on what the most difficult aspects around bias in data collection and bias around data analysis can be. I think the first question I'll ask the panel before I throw it to everybody, so be prepared to ask questions, is a two-parter. One is, what would you consider to be the greatest challenge to reducing bias in data analysis? And then what are the key roles that influence those challenges?
Yes, I'll take this start. The greatest challenge to reduce bias in data is to reduce the bias in the policy system and the data collection and the political will to go about doing that. At the end of the day, the entire system of civil government responds to the political will and questions of that matter. So you want to reduce data bias and the systems that you use that data with, you need to figure out how to influence political will to change those systems, because that's the complete circuit you're going to have to change.
I think to that point around just questions, what kind of questions are you asking? Where are they coming from? Who's deciding that those are the questions that are the most important, that are prioritizing those questions in terms of policy? And going to that community aspect, and what I'm advocating for with design is going out into the community and being able to get the most the questions that should be prioritized, and understanding like what those questions should be requires taking a really big step back and really listening and having the tools to provide a space where people can articulate what they feel is the most important thing safely in a way that is honest and what they actually care about, and that they're not just satisfying your social survey in some way, social science survey.
Kind of building on that, I think one of the things that can be a little bit dangerous is that algorithms are great at doing things for us, right? And that can very quickly lead to a place of complacency, right? We were having a conversation with some folks that were at a very large company that had an event happen. They said, well, we didn't do it this other way because it wouldn't scale, right? And scale is a proxy for just, how do I get fewer humans having to look at this, right? And the thing about bias is that it is the natural state, right? We're a tribal species, unfortunately, right? And so combating it is something that we have to be internally vigilant on. I saw this when I worked at the US Treasury from 2007, 2010. One of my jobs was to build algorithms that would identify bias in lending, right? And it turned out we'd gotten really good at looking for a particular type of bias, right? Which is, oh, you're not giving loans to people of color, right? And that was something we had algorithms that would run every night, and we had that covered. But one of the things that happened in the credit crisis was that the flip what was happening, that there were several lenders that decided, oh, we can actually go out and aggressively give loans that people shouldn't have to people that can't afford them. And because we weren't vigilant enough, we got complacent with our awesome algorithms that were running every night, we missed it.
That was your fault.
Well, yeah. Thanks. Yes.
Well, to take us back to how far back you really need to think to these issues is the reason why loans were not given to communities of color. It goes back to De jure segregation, Richard Russell, Color Law, fantastic book. And in the 50s, we as government institutions and as the public prevented communities of color from having access to mortgage capital. And that decision was probably made, somebody did some data analysis, they thought this was a good idea. Like, they really came from a position of they thought they were promoting social harmony. Like, not that long ago, has had so many consequences that to this day shape every interaction you have in any major metropolitan area in the United States.
So it sounds like the challenge that we're hearing is not so much a technical challenge in the sense that we can create all the algorithms in the world and produce all the tools in the world to help mitigate bias, but if we don't figure out how to properly communicate what it is that we're doing and providing context around the work that we're doing, the bias is always going to exist. Julia?
Yeah, so just to add to that, the issue surely is not purely social, right? It is socio-technical. So what perhaps the greatest challenge is, in my mind, from the technology point of view, is really making explicit the kinds of bias that the data encodes, and making that explicit in a way that is interpretable by humans, so that when a data scientist looks or considers a data set to be used in their algorithmic processes, they can know whether this data is trustworthy or whether it fell off the back of the truck. Or is there a middle ground somewhere, right? So how do we actually communicate with support of computational systems and platforms the kinds of biases that are in the data? And how do we make sure that as the data is processed, as it undergoes multiple steps of transformation in these very, very complex pipelines, and some of these transformations are manual, others are automated, how do we make sure that these annotations, this information about bias is propagated so that it's not lost at some point?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yes, sir.
I had some experience with this in Philadelphia in the early 80s. we were pushing the same data to people about arrest records for black youth. We still had that data even on non-cars, but aged systems. And nothing was done about it. But we also pushed to show when they changed the Medicare law so that people who are receiving benefits couldn't go to a primary care physician. We showed them right away how much money that would cost the state, and the state reversed it. But the reverse, there was public pressure about black youth being arrested, nothing happened. But when there was money involved with having people pay, getting reimbursed money for emergency room visits, that got reversed right away, because legislators thought they were going to lose money. And so I'm just curious in terms of, but the data for black youth getting arrested stays around. And I'm curious about where do you sit there and say, this seems so unrepresentative that someone who's 55 now has arrest records. When you clean, how do you clean that out?
So I'm somewhat let's see, be careful. I'm somewhat optimistic that if you do some of the things that Julie was describing and so on, if you do sort of annotate this stuff, there are ways to correct for this. What is making me nervous right now is that there's this. So what are the problems with this? As you shift to decisions from humans to algorithms, a few things go wrong. One is, if you screw it up, you now can scale up your screw up instantaneously and affect a whole lot of people. When before the humans were sort of the bottleneck, and so it was slow to go. And there's a few other problems, but the one that I think is most insidious is this kind of sanitizing, legitimizing effect, where it's like, well, the computer told me that this is the answer, so therefore, and everyone says, oh, well, the computer told you, it must be right. I mean, we're not, most people are not too stupid to realize that these biases are in the data sets, like you said. We 100 years of policies that led to the bias in the data sets. So you're aware of that, and we can sort of track that. But somehow, when we shift over to the algorithm, we kind of forget that fact. Is what I'm sort of seeing a little bit anecdotally in practice. And so I think I am optimistic that if we pay some attention to it, you can show that just because it's a computer doesn't mean it's no longer biased. So I'm not terrified of a biased data set. I'm terrified of the assumption that it's not biased or something, and that's what I sort of see in practice. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the things I really like about the discussion generally is that, one of the things that could be helpful, right, or generally is helpful, is having a deep sense of kind of insufficiency and kind of and humility. It says we are not sufficient as really smart data scientists and researchers, which means we need to more deeply embed it in the system, as well as telescope out and expand the conversation. And I think that starts with this sense of humility that I and maybe my really smart colleague that's working on me are not going to be sufficient to know the nature of the bias and correct for it. And so we've got to get both social and technical tooling to help us out.
That's right. He had his hand up first.
Yeah, so a couple of you mentioned working with industry, either directly or through some sort of technology transfer. In most industrial settings, the IRB is the legal department. And IRBs are problematic, but in an industry setting, the question is not ethics, it's exposure. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how you can get industrial technology developers how do you incentivize them to do the right thing, especially when there's something sitting downstream of what they're doing?
So I think there's this thing called regulation. And setting aside issues of regulatory capture, one of the issues we've had, especially with emergent technologies in Los Angeles, is figuring out certain industrial actors. Like, we have an amazing Connected Cities partnership with Waze. We share data back and forth. Both LA City data goes into Waze so that you have a better experience trying to avoid that most horrid of subjects traffic. But we also receive a lot of data back trying to improve safety and make sure we hit our Vision Zero targets. So, in that case, we had, a lot of legal review from both our city attorney side and from their legal teams. It was a real fun process to go through. But then the other side of the stick has really been how do we step up and do algorithmic regulation? And I don't necessarily have a policy prescription in this point, but I think at some point, you cannot let industry run amok, with the legal departments giving them clearance to do stuff that we find morally unjust.
Mind if I jump in?
Go right ahead.
Just to so that we don't just push it off on the lawyers, which is a really easy thing to do, right? To say, I would have, but, right? Mm-hmm. The JD beats the whatever, right? The PhD or whatever. I actually think this is a cultural challenge in the data science community, And what I mean with that is that we're actually having this conversation over lunch, right? If a corporate lawyer doesn't understand the value in doing something a particular way, or if the C-suite that would tell the corporate lawyer to figure out a way to do it doesn't understand the value, it's because most likely the internal advocate within the organization that gets it isn't communicating it well enough, or isn't owning kind of the moral responsibility of doing that. And I think we can look to professions, however you feel about them. Both JDs and MDs, right, as a professionalized class, have found ways of institutionalizing ethical responsibility that also affects the way their C-suite and their legal counsels interact with them, right? And I think we, as a community, need to recognize that that's actually a power we can choose to have or to abdicate. And I think largely right now we're abdicating.
So we keep coming back to, and then I'll get to you. We keep coming back to this. We keep coming back to data literacy, and that's really what we're talking about here. Is it's important for the C-suite executive. It's important for the others in the community. It's important for people to understand the data and how it's going to be used in order to then be able to mitigate bias. What role is the importance of data literacy for citizens in order to build the trust with the use of the data? Because they're the ones that have to give up the data.
Right. So when you go into a community and you're just like, tell me all the things, what's going on with your community? Like, you're just mining for information, right? And like that can be terribly exploitive and terribly extractive. And so, yeah, there's a huge responsibility there. And that was part of that prototype that I showed, that index card of just, here's what this data looks like, and here's what data can look like. And I think that's actually a really interesting exercise for data scientists to then not just simplify what you're working on, but to really kind of explain it and imagine your audience. And like that exercise of imagining your audience and how people will receive this information is, I think, a really useful one as you're starting to build out the data sets that you're using, starting to think about the data that you're collecting. If you were to explain this very plainly to someone who it was about, would you feel shame or guilt? That's like an exercise you can do, right? And so I think yeah, those are just like little just sort of design methods that you can employ as an engineer.
Yes, in the gray.
So my question has two parts. One is to Matt's point about how the current institutions are, as you said, insufficient, and also to Bill's point about how we're letting technologists off the hook. So do you see, like, do you have a model for how, or something that you think is possible for how institutions should be, and how to get technologists more involved in the process of considering these ethical concerns?
I got a thought that sort of engages on the industry comment as well, and maybe on the other ones, which is, once again, I guess I feel like I'm a little bit optimistic. So I think we have an example of how a similar sort of story came about, which is around privacy. I think companies used to not really give a flying something about privacy, but eventually customers and people started saying, hey, look, I'm really not going to use your dumb service unless you tell me something about how you're doing the data. And we're not anywhere near where we need to be with privacy, but at least there are privacy policies, and there are some things, even though the regulations took a while to come about. And my prediction, I don't know if I'm going to be right, but my prediction is the same sort of story will happen with this bias stuff, where people will start to say, I want you to expose to me, tell me something about how you're doing this analytics that convinces me that you're not discriminated against groups that I care about. And right now, essentially nobody's doing anything in that regard, and it takes some computational journalist 10 months later to draw a map and show, well, boy, it turns out that you offer that service to, you lay down a map in the city of everywhere you offer the service, and there's like a donut shape carved around Roxbury in Boston, or the south half of Atlanta, or south side of Chicago, or whatever. And it's like, it's not difficult for the data scientists themselves to have drawn those damn maps, right? They shouldn't have waited 10 months. But to change the culture, I think there needs to be a little bit more of a customer, needs to be. I hope there will be a little bit more of a customer-driven kind of thing, where people, by these kinds of events and so on, raising awareness about this, and the data scientists start to figure it out. So I guess wait and see seems like a terrible policy for this, but I do think there's a wind blowing that direction, and we'll start to see some change.
Yeah.
Julia?
Yeah. So I mean, just to kind of state the obvious, data is part of our society, right? I mean, data can make or break the democratic process. So it's actually the responsibility of every individual, let alone a data scientist, but just of every individual to be data literate to the extent that is possible. And it's also the responsibility of us in education to help people become data literate. But responsibility is with every participant in this ecosystem. Right? There isn't one single point of failure. There isn't one judge who decides what is right and what is wrong. It's not all up to us technologists. Citizens have to be data aware and data responsible.
The young lady in green has been trying to ask a question for a minute, and then I'll go to this side and talk to you. Young lady in green?
Hi, I have a question about the technical aspect of bias. So I study causal inference, and bias is kind of baked into the data collection methodology, like survey sampling, and all this thinking in epidemiology and economics. And so you see data releases from sociology always include sampling weights about inclusion or exclusion in the data set. And so I kind of like work with open data from New York City for fun. And there's this very common thing about cities and data science where these same metrics about inclusion and exclusion are discovered after the fact or discovered collectively by the community. I was wondering if you could just comment on these kind of like technical ways of fixing bias, if there needs to be like a community discussion or more awareness of these methods, or a reconsidering of data collection and release to maybe think about measuring bias so it can be corrected for.
Yeah, so one of the things we have with an open data program, and I think where open data vendors have sort of tragically fallen a little short, is there's no documentation of in the open data implementation. It's not necessarily all on the vendor, it's not all on the city, it's this combination of where nobody really said when we started open data, hey, we should mention how building permits data gets onto our portal, how you get a building permit, like what which city planning ordinances are you subject to, what are the biases introduced by the city planning ordinances because you don't need it for certain types of things. What happens when the state changes the law on accessory dwelling units, so suddenly the permit type changes, and we don't document that on our portal until fairly recently. So these are sort of these things of like figuring out how to turn our new open data, open data 2.0 policies in various municipalities across the country into something that really does account for that, since we don't have that standard of practice from, say, sociology around survey data where there's a real standard of practice around response rates.
Do you mind if I ask a follow-up question of you on this?
Yeah.
So like, one of the things I love about this question is it says, look, we actually have a really nice kind of set of tools available to us to like understand and deal with bias in data of all types. And it seems that it's mostly about the inability or unwillingness to invest by the data generators or data kind of releasers in that extra work that it takes. So it seems to me that cities, one of the things that would be great, right, is if cities start to acknowledge data as necessary public infrastructure in the same way we think of roads and power lines and plumbing, and as a result, invest more budget into their kind of functioning maintenance, including things like good survey sampling to know the ways in which 311 data are and aren't reliable for understanding city dynamics, right? Is that something that at the City of LA or any of the other cities you've worked with is even part of the conversation?
I think it's in there in that sort of subtext of how when people say the phrase institutionalizing open data, I'd say 9 times out of 10 when a city government started an open data portal and this piece of, it was driven by an elected official who'd just come in with a mandate of transparency. They found some CSVs on somebody's computer and they uploaded it into a portal. That is not how it works eventually. But there's still a lot of really interesting data that's stored on CSVs on a computer, or if you're lucky at the City of LA, we at least have it on a Google Drive. So one of the questions is how do we build the community that goes and lobbies your city council to say like, hey, we need to, add, Joe Biden, favorite Joe Biden quote of all time is, don't tell me what you value, show me your budget and tell you what you value. Because I will tell you, I cannot think of an open data or data science program inside a municipal government that will not tell you whether they're the second largest city in the country or they are at a small, township in, Salinas County that says they are over-resourced. So how do we find the budget, the time, and the community pressure to like hit those metrics? And what are those metrics? Because I don't think we at the city, to speak to a lot of the other points, would know what those metrics are without engaging the community.
So I'm going to let him ask the last question, potentially.
Yeah,
because we've got 4 minutes left.
One quick comment and then a question for the time. One thing about like engaging citizens, I saw a presentation by someone who's working in Indonesia on civil society engagement. He showed a picture of a protest where the protesters had charts and graphs up as part of their protest material because it was about data literacy for the civil sector. And so they were engaging the data conversation, so it wasn't just a one-way government out to the people, which I think is a really interesting strategy. But my question is about data science and the way, as a data scientist who works in the public sector, I'm increasingly frustrated with this idea that we can just translate things from the private sector into the public sector because the private sector doesn't care about bias. If it's making them money, they don't care about what the model's doing or whatever else is, but we have to because we can't segregate our customer base or focus on one or another. We're trying to serve all citizens. So I'm really kind of interested, particularly from the experience from DSSG or in LA, kind of this experience of applying these techniques that were developed in private industry for profit into doing social good for the public sector. And do we really need to have some other framework, like I believe, of thinking about the public sector data scientist as something separate from someone who's at an ad company or something like that?
I would tend to agree.
Yeah, I mean, the other way, right? From the public sector to the private.
Oh, go ahead.
So that it's responsible by design.
I'm just going to point to a particular quote that I think captures a lot of this thinking in it. So Barack Obama gave a great, someone asked him why you can't just apply business principles to the public sector and have the public sector work exactly like a business. And he gave what I think is one of the most thoughtful and nuanced answers for the ways in which they're different. And I think you're essentially making the same point, right? So I'll just like point folks to read that quote because I think it almost maps one-to-one when we think about kind of the ways in which they are the same and the ways in which they're different. But yeah, totally agree, +1 or whatever.
And please come join us in the public sector if you care about this. We have a lot of job openings across every city, county, and state in the country.
All well-resourced, right?
All well-resourced. And I could not just implore you to come, pick up a shovel and help do the work because nobody else is coming to help.
Yes. You, because you have a mic.
So I guess my question is just maybe a little beyond the scope, but going forward, once these services are created or the services are already there, what are the challenges in getting the right data to provide that, make sure the outreach is there, making sure all populations and all demographics are being educated on that, like they have these resources? Because, I mean, for example, the ACA, when it was created, one of the goals for health equity was not only to ensure more people and get more people on Medicaid, but also to educate them across cultural barriers, making sure they understand they have access to this and this is what they can be provided with. So in terms of data, I mean, it seems like the data we're collecting is biased because of institutional issues or whatever. How is that being addressed?
Well, I think there's process here, and there's bringing people in at all stages when you're developing a service, like when you are doing discovery of like what is the problem, what is actually, just don't assume it, step back, like I was talking about earlier, like just step all the way back and have the community provide the priority for you, and then you re-engage them once you have a prototype of something. You're like, okay, so here's the next idea. How does this feel? What is going on here? And just constantly engaging the community that you're working with at all levels of design and process. I can't advocate for that more. That's human-centered design. You're always bringing in opinions beyond your own and your team. No matter how well educated you are or how much of an expert you are, you're still only one perspective. So having that process.
Okay. Vicky, for the last question.
Given our expertise in general, like in this crowd and design and data science, how do we effectively step into the very messy, ad hoc, reactive world of policy?
So I have the unique privilege of serving 18 wonderful elected officials, from our 15 members of the city council to our mayor, controller, and city attorney. Your job, there are laws on the books governing how a civil servant can interact with data scientists, but data science in general has a long way to go in figuring out how to effectively engage policymakers and how we can short circuit that process that we hinted at earlier of something goes in, it turns out insurance rates are screwed up across another Julia Tiana ProPublica piece. They do amazing work, but they're behind. We can be faster and better serving of our residents than merely waiting it to hit the front page of the LA Times. And I think it's engaging elected officials in sort of a policy response from both a personal level and a, informing them and using data to explain to them and, treating them in the same way you would treat anybody else who might not have a complete amount of data, data literacy the same way a data scientist does.
Thank you. The red light is flashing at us. So that means the session is over. Thank you guys for the wonderful questions.